Welcome back to the Similar Series. In today's episode, we are going to be creating the Global Leaderboards. Now, hopping directly into Studio, the first thing that we're going to do is set up the models. So, inside of our game world, we should already have this model right over here, which is basically just an ordinary board. We actually currently use this to display currency rewards that the player can actually purchase for Robux, and we're actually going to be reusing this model to display the leaderboards to the players as well. So we're going to go ahead and select this model, then we'll duplicate it, and of course, we'll go ahead and move it over a little bit. Now, I'm going to go ahead and reposition this a little bit, and basically, I'm going to store all of my leaderboards over in this side of the map, and of course, you can do it wherever you want to as well. So now that we have this leaderboard repositioned and resized and everything, what I'm going to do is go ahead and rename this model to be called Leaderboard. Now, while we have this model selected, we're actually going to scroll down towards the bottom of its properties, and we're actually going to add a brand new attribute to this. This attribute is going to be of the string type, and we're actually just going to call this attribute type. And now the value of this attribute is what currency or what stat we're actually going to be using for this specific leaderboard. So the value I'll use for our first leaderboard is going to be called clicks because I want to display the clicks leaderboard on this model. Now I'm actually going to move this over a tiny bit more, but now that we have that attribute set, we're all good to go there. So I'm going to go ahead and duplicate this, move it over a little bit. Then for the type of this, we're going to say gems because we want to display the gem leaderboards here. And then we're going to duplicate this one more time, drag it over a tiny bit more. And then for this type, we're going to say reburst because we want to display the reburst leaderboard on this one. So we should now have 3 separate leaderboard models, one for reburst, one for gems, and one for clicks. And with that being said, we're all good for those. But what I also want to do is just quickly explain how this model is set up. Even though we've already used this model in the past and I've probably done it before, I'll just quickly refresh your mind. So this model has a primary part, and the primary part is set to this board part that's stored inside of here. This board part is actually the middle board that is sort of like right inside of this sign. And of course, we have another part inside of this model, which is called outside. This is actually a mesh part, and this is pretty much the entire actual board part itself. So those are the 2 parts that make up this model. While our board part is the primary part of the leaderboard, this is the part that we're going to be working with the most, and we actually won't even touch the outside part at all. And we're going to actually use the board part to display the GUI of the leaderboard itself to the player. And with that being said, let's actually start working on creating this GUI. So in order to create the GUI, we are going to select any of the leaderboards and select any of their board part. And inside of there, we're going to create a service GUI. We'll rename the service GUI to be called Leaderboard GUI. And now we want to modify just a few properties of the leaderboard GUI itself. We want to set the light influence to 0 because we don't want it to be influenced by light at all. We also want to set the reset on spawn property to false. And you can modify the max distance as well. But for right now, I'm just going to leave that at 1000. Next, what we're going to do is throw a frame inside of our leaderboard GUI. And then we want to update its size to be the entire width and length of the part. So we're going to set the size to 1 on the X and the Y scale so that it stretches the entire width and height of the part. Now that we've done that, we're also going to update its background color. And we're actually going to use the same background color as our sort of darker blue buttons. So that looks pretty good. Next, what we're going to do is throw a text label inside of here, and we're going to rename this to be called title. Now, for the size of this, we want it to be the entire width, but then we'll set it to 0.1 on the Y because we only want it to be 1/10 of the actual height. Then for the text of this, we're going to say something like most clicks, and we'll set the text to be scaled. We'll also set the text color to be white. Then for the background transparency, we're going to set that to 1. We'll go ahead and adjust its font. Of course, we're going to set that to Gotham, and we'll also make that bold. Then we're going to go ahead and duplicate this text label, and this time we're going to rename it to be called refresh. Now, for the text of this, we're going to say refresh is in. Then we'll say something like 05:00 mins, because this text label is going to be used to display to the player how much time is left before the leaderboard is refreshed. In addition to modifying the text, we're also going to make it a tiny bit smaller on the Z-axis. So instead of going with 0.1, we're actually going to go with 0.085. And then for the position, we're only going to adjust the Y scale, and we're going to set that to 0.915 so that it appears at the very bottom of this frame. And I think that's looking pretty good as well. The next thing that we're going to do is go ahead and add in a scrolling frame inside of here, and we're going to rename this to be called container. Then for the size of this on the X scale, we're going to go with 0.975, and on the Y scale, we're going to go with 0.8. Now that we've done that, we want to reposition it, and of course, we do want to make it centered on the X axis, so we're going to set that to 0.5 as well as that to 0.5, and then on the Y scale, we are going to set that to 0.1 so that it appears between the title and the refresh text labels. We'll then go ahead and set the automatic canvas size to Y because we do want its size to increase based on the amount of children that we have inside of it. And then we'll also modify the canvas size as well. And we'll modify the Y from 2 down to 1. Along with that, we're going to set the background transparency to 1. And then we're also going to set the scroll bar inset. And here we want to set the vertical scroll bar inset to be always. And we could also modify the scroll bar color or its thickness if we wanted to, but I think the thickness is fine. And I also think the color is perfectly fine for this as well. But of course, if you want to change that, you certainly can. Now that we've made all those changes to the container, we're going to go ahead and throw in a UI list layout inside of here. Along with that, we're going to go ahead and throw a frame inside of here as well. Now, for the size of the frame, on the X scale, we're going to make that 0.975, and on the Y scale, we're going to make that 0.1. We'll then adjust the background color of this, and we're actually going to go with our lighter blue that we used for our currency labels. Then we'll actually duplicate the title text label and put that inside of our frame. And instead of this being called title, we're actually going to call this place. We're of course going to resize it, and with this sizing, we're actually going to swap around the X and the Y. So on the X scale, we're going to set that to 0.1, while on the Y scale, we're going to set that to 1. Then for the text of this, we actually want to say something like 100 or 99 or one of those numbers, because this text label is going to be used to display the actual place that the player is at in the rankings of the leaderboards. Next, what we're going to do is duplicate the place text label, and we're going to rename this to be called player. We'll then set the text of this to be the actual player's name, so I'm just going to say something like MonzterDEV. Of course, we're going to resize this, so on the X scale, I'm going to set that to 0.4, and on the Y scale, I'm going to set that to 0.85. Then for the positioning of this, of course, we do want to center this vertically, so we're going to set that to 0.5 and that to 0.5. And for the position on the X scale, we're actually going to set that to 0.125 to move it just a little bit over from the actual place text label. Another thing that we want to do is actually set the text X alignment of the player text label to actually be left. And then if you wanted to, you could also increase the size of this on the X scale a little bit as well. So you could even set this to 0.5 or make it a tiny bit larger as well. Then we're going to go ahead and duplicate the player text label, and we're going to rename this to be called amount. Now for the text of this, we could say something like 999.99M, because this text label is going to display the amount of clicks that the player has actually accumulated. And with this, we actually want to set the text X alignment to be right. Now that we've done that, let's also go ahead and resize it. On the X scale, we're going to go with 0.3, and on the Y, we're going to go with 1. Now we want to go ahead and reposition this as well. And on the X scale, we're going to set the position to 0.7 so that it appears all the way towards the right side of the frame. And now with all that being said, we have created our template frame, and I think that's looking pretty good. So this is how the players are going to be displayed on our leaderboard. Now that I've duplicated this a couple of times, let's go ahead and start modifying the UI list layout a little bit. For the padding of this, we're actually going to set this to 0.015 so that there's just a little bit of spacing between each of them. We'll then also set the horizontal alignment to center, and that's pretty much all that we actually have to do inside of here. So now that we've done that, let's go ahead and delete all of the frames except for one, and then we're going to rename this last one to be called template. And now with all that being said, we're actually done with creating this GUI. So what we're going to do is remove this GUI from that actual part, and instead we're actually going to store this GUI inside of our server storage. So now that we've done all of that, we can finally get started with actually scripting the system. In order to get started with scripting the system, we're going to go inside of the server script service, and we're actually going to create a brand new module script. We're going to go ahead and rename this module script to be called leaderboards. And of course, we'll go ahead and rename the module variable as well. Now that we've done all of that, we of course have to start making some of our service variables. So we're going to want to get the data store service, the replicated storage, the server storage, the user service, the workspace, and the player service as well. Along with that, we want to get our format number module as well as our format time module, which are both stored inside of the libs folder inside of our replicated storage. And now once we've created all of those variables, we can finally start getting into our actual scripting. So the first thing that we're going to do is create a variable called data stores. And this is going to be equal to a table. Now, inside of this table, we are going to get 3 separate data stores, which is where we're going to store all the data for our leaderboards. So the first leaderboard data store that we're going to set up is actually going to be for clicks. So we're going to say clicks equals, and then we're going to use the data store service. And we're specifically going to use the get ordered data store method of the data store service. And now we need to pass through a name of the data store that we want to get to this method. And how we're going to name our leaderboard data stores is with this naming convention here. So we'll say leaderboard underscore, and then after the underscore is where we'll actually include the name of the specific currency or whatever measurement we're actually using for that leaderboard. So for the name of our clicks leaderboard, we're going to be using leaderboard underscore clicks. And now we're basically going to do this exact same thing 2 other times for the other currencies that we're creating leaderboards for as well. So we can go ahead, copy and paste this. This time, instead of clicks though, we're going to be creating the leaderboard for the reburst currency. So instead of clicks, we're going to say reburst, then we'll paste it one final time. And instead of clicks or reburst, this is going to be for gems. And there we go. We now have all 3 of the data stores that we need. Now, if you guys are unfamiliar with using the data store service, I don't blame you. Most of the time, it's better to use other people's libraries, such as the profile service, to handle all of your data saving stuff rather than working with the data store service yourself. When it comes to leaderboards, though, I really haven't found a great library that makes this easy to do, so we're going to be handling this ourselves. Now, generally, when you use the data store service, you'll generally use the method called getDataStore. And this method just creates a standard data store where you can actually store your data inside of. Instead, though, we're going to be using getOrderDataStore, which is pretty similar to our other method, but the only difference between these 2 types of data stores is that with an ordered data store, all the values stored inside of here have to be positive numbers. Along with that, will actually give us access to the method called getSortedAsync. And this method is basically the key thing that we need to use here for our leaderboard, because we want to be able to get and display all of the players which have accumulated the highest amount of clicks, rebirths, and gems. Anyways, now that we've created a variable for all of our data stores, the next thing we're going to do is create a variable for the GUI that we just created. So we're going to say local leaderboard GUI equals, and where do we store that? We store that inside of the server storage, and that is called leaderboard GUI. Now, after we've created that variable, we're actually going to create a type, and we're going to export this type so that other modules which require this module can also use that type. And the type that we're going to create is going to be called leaderboard type. And we're going to set that equal to a string union, and each string is going to be a different type of leaderboard. So our first type is going to be called clicks, our second type is going to be called rebirths, and our third and final type is going to be called gems. Now that we've done that, the next thing we're going to do is create a brand new variable, which is going to be called leaderboard parts, and that's going to be equal to a blank table. Now, to make this a little bit easier to understand, I'm actually going to define the type of this variable. So we're actually going to be using this variable to store all of the leaderboard models which are stored inside of our workspace. So the type of this variable is actually going to be a table, more specifically an array. So the keys that are going to be stored inside of this table are going to be numbers. And now the values that these keys are going to hold are going to be tables as well, which have two different properties. These tables are going to have a model property, which of course is going to hold the actual model of the leaderboard. And it's also going to hold a type property, which is going to be of the leaderboard type. And more specifically, the type property is going to actually be the type of leaderboard that the model actually is. So that's what this table is going to store. So now that we've created that variable, let's go ahead and start creating some functions. The first function that we're going to create is going to be called set leaderboard parts, and it's not going to have any parameters. Now, this function is going to be used to actually set the leaderboard parts variable that we just created. So we want to go through all of the leaderboards which are currently inside of our workspace and add them to the variable that we created earlier. So to do this, we're going to say for underscore comma descendant in workspace get descendants do. Now, depending on how you named your leaderboards, the name of the model should actually be simply just leaderboard, but if you name that a little bit differently, then we can also work with that. So we're going to use the find method on the name string, and we're going to look for the word leaderboard inside of its name. So if we are able to find leaderboard inside of its name, then we know that that's one of the models that we're looking for. And to also confirm this, we want to make sure that this descendant is a model as well. So if it's both a model and we're able to find leaderboard in the name, then we know that this is one of the models that we're actually looking to work with. Now that we've found one of the models that we're looking to work with, let's go ahead and get the type of that actual leaderboard. And how do we do this? Well, remember, we actually set an attribute on the model, which is called type. So if we actually do get that type attribute, then what we're going to do is go ahead and add this model to the leaderboard parts variable. So we're going to say table.insert. Then we want to insert into the leaderboard parts table. And what do we want to insert? Well, we want to insert a brand new table with two different properties. So we want to have the model property, which is going to be equal to the descendant. And we also want to have the type property, which is going to be equal to the type variable that we just extracted from the model itself. And that's actually all that we're going to do inside of this function. And now that we've created this function, let's go ahead and actually call it towards the bottom of this script right before we actually return our leaderboards variable. And the reason that we're calling it right after we create it is because we want this to run as soon as the script is loaded for the first time. Now below that function, we're going to go ahead and create another function. This function is going to be called get all leaderboard parts of. And this is going to have a parameter, which is called leaderboard type. So we're going to pass through the specific type of leaderboard that we want to get all of the parts of to this function. So what we want to do inside of this function is first create a table, which is going to be called leaderboards, and that's going to be equal to a blank table. Then we want to loop through the leaderboard parts variable that we created earlier. So we want to loop through all of our actual leaderboards. So we're going to say for underscore leaderboard info in leaderboard parts do. Now, if the leaderboard info has a type property, which is the same as the type that we passed as a parameter to this function, then we know that that's one of the leaderboards that we're looking for. And we want to add that leaderboard to our leaderboards table that we just created. So we're going to say table.insert. We're going to insert that into the leaderboards table that we just created. And we're going to insert the leaderboard info into that table. Then after this for loop is finished, the last thing that we're going to do is go ahead and return the leaderboards variable. Now we're going to go ahead and create one more function after this, which is going to be called create leaderboard GUIs. And with this function, we want to create all the service GUIs that we need to make for each individual leaderboard. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to loop through all of the leaderboard parts once again. And now as we're iterating through each of them, we want to go ahead and create a GUI and parent that GUI to the primary part of the model. So we're going to say local GUI equals leaderboard GUI, and then we're going to clone that. Then we're going to go ahead and parent that to the primary part inside of the model, inside of the leaderboard info table. And now once we've parented it, we also want to update the text of the title text label stored inside of this GUI to display what this leaderboard actually is. So we're going to say GUI.frame.title.text equals, and then we're going to update that with the leaderboard info.type. And now we'll actually also call this function, but after we've called the set leaderboard parts function as well. Because first we need to call this function so that the leaderboard parts variable is actually set up. And then once we have that variable set up, we can go ahead and actually create all the GUIs that each of them need. Now we're going to go back towards the top of our script, and below where we create the leaderboard parts variable, we're going to go ahead and create another type. This type is actually going to be called state info, and this is going to be equal to a table, and this table is going to have two properties inside of it. The first property is going to be called user ID, which is going to be a number, and the second property is going to be called amount, which is also going to be a number as well. Now, when we're using the word state here, we're of course referring to data or the structure of data and not a location inside of the United States. So state info is going to be a table, which is going to hold the user ID of a player, as well as the amount that they've accumulated in the specific leaderboard. Now, of course, if you're having a hard time understanding this, don't worry, wait for us to go a little bit further, and then you should easily be able to connect the dots from there. Now that we've created that type, we're going to go ahead and actually create another variable, which is going to be called leaderboard state, and this is going to be equal to a table as well. Now, before we create the table, let's actually go ahead and set the type of this table as well. So the type of this table is of course going to be a table. Now for the keys of this table, we're actually going to be using leaderboard types for keys, and now the value of each leaderboard type is actually going to be another table, and what we're actually going to store inside of this table for each leaderboard type is going to be all the state info for each player of that specific leaderboard. So the key is going to be a number, and the value is going to be state info. Now this still might be a little bit hard to grasp, but don't worry. Going inside of our leaderboard state table, what we're first going to do is add clicks to this. Then for the value of clicks, we're going to set that equal to a blank table. Now this blank table is going to be an array and not a dictionary. So let me give you a quick example of what this table is going to look like. Even though we're not going to set this value manually, I'm going to manually set it right now just to give you a better understanding of what this table is going to look like when it comes to using it. So remember, the value of clicks is going to be a table, which more specifically is going to be an array, not a dictionary, which would hold key value pairs. Instead, this is going to be an array, so it goes in a very specific order. So I added a brand new table inside of this array, and it's going to have a property called user ID, which is going to be equal to a number. It'll also have another property called amount, which is going to be equal to a number as well. And the amount property will of course refer to the amount that the player has accumulated for this specific type of leaderboard. So I just added another example to this table to show that it holds two different players. It holds their user IDs as well as the amount that they have earned for this specific leaderboard type. So we're actually going to be using these tables to store the leaderboard data of the top 100 players inside of here, and then we can also easily sort these tables as well so that we can easily display to the players in our game who is the number 1 player all the way down to the 100th player on our leaderboards. So anyway, that's what the data structure is going to look like. I'm going to go ahead and delete all those and just set clicks to a blank table as it should be. After clicks though, we still have to add both rebirths and gems, so let's go ahead and add both those to here. And cool, now we've added all those to the leaderboard state table, we are good with that. Now, a little bit below this variable, we're going to go ahead and create another variable. This is actually going to be a constant variable, so we're going to write this in all capital letters, and it's going to be called get state time in seconds. And we're going to set that equal to 60 for right now. And what we're going to use this variable for is how often we should refresh the leaderboard to gather all the new data for the top 100 players, if any of that has changed, and then display that to all the players who are currently inside of our game. And now that we've set this to 60, that means that we're going to refresh this data every 60 seconds. So we're going to pull that data every 60 seconds. And of course, we can change this to make it more frequent or less frequent, depending on our specific needs. Now, the next thing we're going to do is go ahead and start creating some more functions. And we're going to create these below where we created the create leaderboard GUIs function. So this function is going to be called fetch leaderboard states, and it's not going to have any parameters. Now, the first thing that we want to actually do inside of this function is actually reset our leaderboard state variable that we just created. So we're going to say leaderboard state equals, then we're going to create a table, then we'll say clicks equals a blank table, rebirths equals a blank table, and finally gems equals a blank table as well. Now, the reason that we're doing this is because we're not only going to be using this function a single time to fetch all the leaderboard's data. Instead, we're going to be using this as soon as the script loads, so basically when our game first initializes to get all that data, and then we're also going to periodically fetch that data as well. And each time we fetch that data, we want to clear out the old leaderboard information and replace that all with the new leaderboard information. So now what we want to do is loop through all of our data stores that we created earlier, and then we basically want to get all of the data from it once again. So we're going to say for leaderboard type, comma data store, in data stores do. Now, as we iterate through each of these data stores, we're going to go ahead and create a variable called pages. And what we want to set this variable to is to the data that's stored inside of that data store. So we're going to say data store, and then we're going to use the get get sorted async method of the data store. Now for our first argument, we're going to say false because the first parameter of this function is asking us if we want it in the ascending order, and ascending is from smallest to largest, and that's the opposite of what we want. We want to get the player with the most amount of points and then go down to the smallest amount. Now the second parameter is actually the page size, which in our scenario basically refers to how many players do we want to get per page, and we want to get 100. So now what's returned by this function is actually data store pages, and we want to get the current page, which has all the data inside of it that we actually want to work with. So we're going to say local items equals pages, and then we want to use the get current page method on it. And we're calling this variable items because this function will basically return to us the data of all the players on that page. So now that we have all that data that we need, what we then want to do is loop through all the items inside of that variable and then get the user ID as well as the amount from that item and then update our leaderboard state variable with that information. So we're going to say for underscore item in items do. Then we'll create a variable called user ID, which is actually going to be the key of that item. And then we'll create a variable called amount, which is actually going to be the value of that item. And now that we have both of those, what we're going to do is insert those into their leaderboard state variable as they should be. So we're going to say table.insert. Then we're going to insert that into the leaderboard state table, but we want to insert them into the specific leaderboard type table inside of the leaderboard state table. So we're going to index the leaderboard state table with the type of the leaderboard. And now that we've defined the table that we want to insert into, let's go ahead and insert the specific data. And the specific data that we want to insert is actually the user ID, which is going to be equal to the user ID variable that we just created, and then also amount, which is going to be equal to the amount variable that we just created as well. So now we're almost done with this function, but we do need to do just a few more things. Let's go back towards the top of our script, and below where we create the leaderboard state variable and above where we create our get state time in seconds variable, what we're going to do is create a variable called last state update time, and we're not going to set that equal to anything yet. But now that we've created that variable, let's go back down to our fetch leaderboard state function. And after this for loop, so after we get all of that data, what we want to do is actually update our last state update time variable with the current time. So we're going to set that equal to os.time. So now we've added that to this function, we're done with this function for right now. Now, after we call the set leaderboard parts function, as well as the create leaderboard GUIs function, what we're going to do is go ahead and fetch the leaderboard states. So what this is going to do is it's going to fetch all of the information about our leaderboards that we actually need to create them, and that's the information that we also need to be able to display to the player. But another thing that we need to keep in mind is that we don't want to get this information just one time. We periodically want to grab this information as well in order to display the latest information for each leaderboard to all the players that are currently in our game. So in order to get the data periodically, what we're going to do is we're going to say task.spawn, and we're going to create an anonymous function inside of here, and then we're going to use a while true loop. So we're going to say while true do, and inside of here, we're going to wait 1 second. Then inside of this while loop, before our task.wait, what we're going to do is create a p call, and we're going to go ahead and create an anonymous function inside of this p call. And now inside of this p call, we're going to determine if we should refresh the leaderboards or not. So we're going to create a variable called should refresh, which is going to be equal to os.time. And we're going to subtract the last state update time from the current time. And now if the amount of time that has passed is greater than or equal to our get state time in seconds variable, then we know that we should actually refresh the data. So we're going to say if should refresh then, and what we're going to do is go ahead and call the fetch leaderboard states function once again. So now with that being implemented, we are periodically fetching new data and updating our leaderboards. Now the next thing that we want to do is actually begin adding players and displaying them on each of our individual leaderboards. In order to do this, we're going to go ahead and create a brand new function below our create leaderboard GUIs function and above the fetch leaderboard states function. And this function is going to be called add player to leaderboards. It's going to accept the user ID, which is going to be a number, the leaderboard type, which is going to be of our leaderboard type that we created earlier, and amount, which is also going to be a number. And now the final parameter that we're going to have in here is going to be called place, which is going to be another number as well. Cool. So now the first thing we're going to do inside of this function is get some information about the specific player from their user ID. So we're going to say local success, comma, player info equals, and we have to use a p call for this. So we're going to go ahead and create an anonymous function inside of that p call, and we're going to go ahead and return something. And what we're going to return is something that we get from using the user service, and more specifically, the get user infos by user IDs async method. Now, this method actually accepts an array of user IDs, and what it returns back to us is an array of user information, including their username and display name. Now, when we're using this function, we're actually only going to be using this function for a single player, not multiple players. So we don't care about multiple user IDs, we only care about a single user ID. So when we call the get user infos by user IDs async function, what we have to do is pass through a table inside of here. And inside of this table, we just need to insert the player's user ID. Now, another thing that we want to do just to be precautious is use the toNumber function on the specific user ID. And the reason that we're doing that is just in case the player's user ID was passed to this function as actually a string, then we want to call toNumber on that to make sure that this function doesn't get messed up, just in case we accidentally pass through a string rather than a number. And remember, if you're having issues with this, make sure that you're passing through the user ID to this function inside of a table, because this function is designed to work with multiple user IDs in mind, and it's okay to use only a single user ID, but we still need to pass that through in a table, as we're doing right here. So now, after we get the user information, what we're going to do is create a variable called name, and we're going to set the player's name right here. Now, how we're going to set the player's name is depending on what information is returned to us. So what we want to do is index the player info and index that with 1, because we actually want to get the first element that was returned to us inside of this table. Because again, remember, this function is meant to work with a variety of player user IDs. So that's why it accepts a table and then it returns a table back to us, which possibly could hold multiple players' information. And instead, in our scenario, it's only holding 1. So we're going to index that table with 1 to get the player's information that we're looking for. And if that table actually exists, then we're going to say player info, index that with 1, and then we're going to get the display name property that's stored inside of here. Otherwise, we'll set the player's name to their user ID if for some reason we're unable to get their display name. Now that we've done that, the next thing we want to do is get all the leaderboard parts of the specific leaderboard type that we're looking for inside of our workspace. So we're going to say local leaderboards, and we're actually going to use that get all leaderboard parts of function that we created earlier and pass through our specific leaderboard type. Then, of course, we're going to go ahead and loop through all those leaderboards. Now, as we iterate through them, we're going to go ahead and create a variable called model. And of course, that's going to be equal to info.model. And now that we've gotten its model, the next thing we want to do is get the GUI that's stored inside of the model's primary part. So we're going to say model.primary part, and then we can index that with the leaderboard GUI because that's the GUI that we're looking for. Now that we have the GUI that we're looking for, we're going to go ahead and create a variable for the container, which is stored inside of the GUI, but inside of the frame. So GUI.frame.container. Then inside of our container, we have the template. And of course, we're going to go ahead and clone that. So we're going to say container.template, and then we're going to clone that. Now that we've cloned that, of course, we want to parent that to the container. So we're going to say .parent equals container. And we also want to make it visible as well. So we're going to set the visible property to true. Then let's also go ahead and update the name of the template, and we'll set that equal to the player's user ID. Then let's go ahead and update the player text label to display the player's display name. So we're going to set that equal to the name variable. Then we're going to go ahead and update the text of the amount text label. Of course, to update this, we're going to use the format number library, and we're going to use format compact on the amount variable. And finally, we want to update the text of the place text label that's stored inside of the clone, and we're going to go ahead and set that to the place number that was also passed to this function as well. And now that we've updated the place text label, we actually also want to update the layout order property of the clone as well, so that it's displayed where it should be based on its place. So we're going to say clone.layout order equals, and then we'll set that equal to place. Awesome. And now that we've created this function, we can actually go ahead and use it, and we're going to use it inside of our fetch leaderboard states function. And we're actually going to use it after we insert the information about the specific player on that specific leaderboard into our leaderboard state table. So after we do all of that, we're going to go ahead and call the add player to leaderboards function. We're going to pass through the user ID, the leaderboard type, and then finally underscore, but we're actually going to rename this to be called index. So let's go ahead and rename that and update that variable. And then finally the index, which would actually be the place of the player. And cool. Now we're actually adding the player and displaying them on the leaderboards that they appear on. But now another thing that we have to consider is that we are doing this inside of the fetch leaderboard state function, which is ran periodically throughout our game. So since we're doing this periodically, another thing that we need to do is actually clean up the leaderboard before adding more players to it. So in order to do this, we're going to go ahead and create another function, which is going to be called clean containers. And now what we're going to do is loop through all of the leaderboard parts in our game, go through every single one of those GUIs, and then we're going to remove all of the clone templates from inside of the container. And then after that's been completed, we'll go ahead and re-add all the players and new players based on the new data. So we're going to say for underscore leaderboard part in leaderboard parts do. We'll then create a variable called GUI, which of course is equal to leaderboard part dot model dot primary part dot leaderboard GUI. Then we're going to go ahead and create a variable for the container, which of course is inside of the frame, inside of the GUI, and the container is called container. Then we're going to go ahead and loop through all the children inside of the container. So container get children. Now actually, instead of calling the values children, we should actually just call this child. But anyway, if the name of the child does not equal template and the child is a frame, then we know that we got the clone that we're actually looking for. And what we're going to do with that child is we are going to destroy them. So again, this is going to go through the container, look for all those frames that we actually cloned, And if they're not named template and they aren't framed, then we know that those are the ones that we're looking for, and we're going to go ahead and delete them. Cool. So now that we've created this function, let's go back to fetch leaderboard states function. And right before we actually loop through all of the data stores, get all the fresh data, and add all of the players to them, what we're going to do is go ahead and call the clean container function. Cool. So now that we've done all of that and we're actually starting to handle the GUI, we pretty much have done everything with the GUI that we need to do, but there's actually one more thing, and that's actually updating the text label, which displays how much time until the leaderboards refresh to the player. So in order to do this, we're going to go ahead and create a brand new function above our clean container function, which is going to be called update refresh display. The first thing that we're going to do inside of this function is create a variable called time until refresh, and that's going to be equal to the get state time in seconds variable subtracted by the current time, also subtracted from the last state update time. And that'll give us the amount of time in seconds before the next update will happen. Now that we have all that information, we basically have to loop through all of our leaderboard parts, get the GUIs, and then update that text label that's stored inside of all of them. So we're going to say for underscore leaderboard part in leaderboard parts do. Then again, we'll go ahead and get the GUI. Let's just go ahead and literally copy and paste it from the clean container function. So now that we have the GUI, we're going to go inside of the frame stored inside of that GUI, and inside of that frame, we have a text label called refresh, and we're going to set the text of that equal to refreshes in, and then we'll display the amount of seconds, but we'll use the format time library, and then we'll use the convert to HMS function, and we'll convert the time until refresh seconds into the number, how we want it to be displayed, and then that'll be displayed to the player. And now that we've created this function, we actually only have to call it one single time. And now where are we actually going to call this function? Well, inside of our while loop that runs every single second. And we're actually going to call this after we determine if it should refresh or not, and right before the task.wait1. So we're going to say update refresh display right there, and it'll update with the amount of time until it will be refreshed. Now, going back towards the top of our script, the next thing that we actually need to implement is tracking all of the players' progress that counts towards the leaderboards. So in between our leaderboard state and the last state update time variables, what we're going to do is create a brand new type called earnings, and that's going to be equal to a table. Now, how the earnings table is going to be set up is it's actually going to be a dictionary, which is going to hold key value pairs with the keys being the player's user ID, and then the values being tables. And we'll go over the values in a second. So we're first going to say number, and now for the value, again, it's going to be a table, and now this table is also going to be a dictionary, which is going to hold leaderboard types as keys, and the value is going to be a number of how much of that specific currency the player has earned in a given time. So to make this a little bit easier to understand, we're going to say clicks, that's going to be a number. We'll say rebirths, that's going to be a number. And finally, we're going to say gems, which is also going to be a number. Now that we've created that type, let's go ahead and create a variable called default earnings, which is going to be equal to a table. And now inside of this table, we're going to say clicks equals 0, rebirths equals 0, and finally gems equals 0. Okay, you're probably still following along with me now. Next, what we're going to do is create a variable called earnings, and we're going to set that to the earnings type, and we're going to set that equal to a blank table. Now that we've created the earnings variable, remember the script that we've been working in, although we've been working in it locally and we really haven't done anything with it as a module script, this is the first thing that we're going to add to the module. So we're going to say leaderboards.earnings equals, and we're going to set that equal to our earnings local variable. So what we're actually going to be using the earnings variable for is, again, to attract the specific amount of currency or leaderboard type that the player has accumulated during their play session. So as a player earns clicks in our game, we want to store all the clicks that count towards the leaderboard position in this table so that we can save that data inside of a data store in order to update the player's position of that leaderboard, basically. Now, I still might not be explaining this the best or the easiest way to understand, so sorry for that, but it should be easier to grasp as we start implementing this. Now, before we start implementing this, we also want to create one more constant, which is going to be called save earnings time in seconds. And this is actually going to be the amount of time that we want to wait before saving the player's data to the data store. And we're going to set this to a relatively low number, which is going to be 20. So every 20 seconds, we're going to be saving the player's data. We will come back towards the end of the episode and make these numbers a little bit higher. Now, the first thing we're going to do to start implementing sort of the player data saving side of things is to go ahead and create a shared function. This function is going to be called adjust leaderboard. It's going to accept a player, which of course is going to be a player, amount, which is going to be a number, and finally the leaderboard type, which of course is of the leaderboard type. Now, when we use this function, what we want to do is we want to check if the amount variable passed to this is greater than 0. And if it is greater than 0, then we're going to go ahead and add the amount to the player's earnings. But first, before we do that, we want to make sure that the player has an earnings table created. So we're going to say if leaderboards.earnings, then we're going to index that with the player.userID. So if they do have an earnings table, then we're going to go ahead and update that. So we're going to say leaderboards.earnings, index that with the player.userID. Then we're going to index that table with the specific leaderboard type, and we're going to go ahead and add the amount to that already existing amount. Now, where we're actually going to use this function is inside of our player data manager. That's why we actually called it adjust leaderboard to go along with the theme of those functions. Let's actually go ahead and implement and use this function to help you better understand exactly what we're doing and what we're working with. So in order to implement implement this function, we're going to go inside of the server script service, inside of the player data folder, and open up the manager module script. Inside of here, below our badges config, we also want to require the leaderboards module that we just created inside of the server script service. So we could create a variable for the server script service, or we could say script.parent.parent.leaderboards. And then we can go ahead and, of course, rename this variable. Now that we've required that module, we can go into each of our adjust functions. So we'll first start off with adjust reburst, and we'll say leaderboards.adjust leaderboard. We'll pass through the player, we'll pass through the amount, and for the leaderboard type, we're going to be saying reburst. Then we can go ahead and copy and paste that into the adjust gems function. And instead of saying reburst, we're going to say gems. And lastly, we can do that for clicks as well. Of course, instead of reburst, we're going to be saying clicks for this leaderboard type. And that's actually all that we have to do inside of this manager script. So every single time these functions are called for every single player, this function is also going to be called as well. And now if we go back to our leaderboards module script, remember, we're checking if the amount is greater than 0. So if we use this function adjust clicks to adjust the player's clicks, say whenever a player purchases an item from a shop and we reduce their amount of clicks, the leaderboards will not take that into account because it only takes into account positive numbers. Now, of course, if you only want specific ways of earning clicks, gems, or rebursts to be taken into account when it comes to the leaderboards, then you can certainly modify the system to work with your needs as well. But with that being said, that's all that we have to do inside of this manager script, so we can go ahead and close out of that and return back to our leaderboards module. So now that we have a better understanding of how we're actually tracking the player's stats for each of the individual leaderboards and the leaderboard types, what we next need to implement is actually saving the player's data. So we're going to go down towards the bottom of our script, and even below our fetch leaderboard state function, we're going to go ahead and create a new function. This function is going to be called save player data, and it's going to accept a player. The first thing we want to do inside of this function is actually get the player's earnings. So we're going to say local earnings equals leaderboards.earnings, and then index that with the specific player's user ID. Now, if the player doesn't have an earnings table, then we're going to go ahead and stop the function right there because we don't need to save their data. The next thing we want to do is loop through all of the player's earnings, and if they have earned anything, then we want to go ahead and save that. So we're going to say for currency, comma, amount in earnings due. Then we'll create a variable called has earned. And the way that we can determine if the player has actually earned anything is if the amount variable is greater than 0. So if the player has earned something, then like I said, we want to go ahead and save that data. Now, in order to save that data, we need to go ahead and use one of our data stores. But first, we need to get the specific data store that we want to use. And the way that we can do that is by indexing our data stores table with the currencies. Because remember, the currencies are basically just our data store type variable as well. And now that we've gotten that specific data store, we want to go ahead and use the increment async method. And with this method, we want to actually go ahead and pass the player's user ID, but as a string for the first argument. And for the second argument, we want to actually pass through the amount variable. So what increment async is actually going to do of the specific data store is it's going to look for our player user ID as the specific key, and then it's going to update its value. So it's going to increment its value, and increment basically just means increase. So it's going to increment the value of that key by the amount that we're giving it. So if the value of the player's key was originally set to 10 and the amount variable is equal to 20, then once we use increment async, the player's value will now equal 30 because 10 plus 20 equals 30. Anyways, once we've saved the player's earning, the next thing that we need to do is set the earning of that specific type back to 0. So we're going to say leaderboards.earnings, index that with a specific player user ID, and then index that with a specific currency, and then we're going to set that back to 0 so that the player can earn more, and then we can track that once again. And that's actually all that we have to do inside of this function. Now to use this function, well, we're actually going to go ahead and create a function below this, which is going to be called create save loop. And it's only going to have one parameter, which is going to be a player. And inside of this function, all we're going to do is create a while true loop, and we're simply going to go ahead and call the save player data function, passing through the player. And after we call this function, we're going to say task.wait, and we're actually going to use the save earnings time in seconds variable as our delay. So the player's data will only be saved, say, every 20 seconds or whatever you have this variable set to. Now, I actually made one mistake here. It's not actually supposed to be a while true loop. It's actually supposed to be a while player loop. And the reason that we're doing that is because we only want this while loop to run while the player is actually in our game. Once the player no longer exists, we no longer need to save their data, so we can actually cancel this loop out. With that being said, now that we've created that function, let's go ahead and actually start using that one. When are we going to use it? Well, we're actually going to use that function whenever a player is added to our game. So we're going to say players.playerAdded::connect, create an anonymous function, which is going to have a player. Now, whenever a player joins our game, we want to add them to our earnings table. So we're going to say leaderboards.earnings, index that with the player.user_ID, and set that equal to the default earnings table. So after we add that player to the earnings table, then we want to go ahead and create a save loop for that player. So we're going to say create save loop, and we're going to add that player to the save loop. So now we've effectively set up saving the player's data whenever they join our game. Along with the player added event, before we even do that, we also want to loop through all the players which are currently in our game, and we mostly only need to do this for testing inside a studio, because in a normal game, every single player should be accounted for by listening to a player added event, but just in case they're not, we're going to go ahead and say for_player in players get players do, and then we're going to go ahead and paste the same thing inside of there. Now that we've done that, we also want to save the player's data whenever they leave our game. So we're going to say players.player_removing :connect, create an anonymous function. And like I said, whenever a player is leaving, we want to go ahead and actually call the save player data function, pass through the player. And then we also want to remove them from the earnings table. So we're going to say leaderboards.earnings, index that with the player.user_ID, and then set that equal to nil. And aside from the player leaving, we also want to listen for the server to shut down as well. So we're going to say game: bind to close, create an anonymous function. And then whenever the game is closing down, we also want to save the data of all the players that are currently in the game as well. So we're going to say for_player in players get players do. And then we're going to go ahead and call save player data on that specific player. Oops, there's actually one more small mistake that I made. When our script starts up and we loop through all the players that are currently in our game, and then we create a save loop for them, what I forgot to do is that we actually need to say task.spawn in order to prevent the script from stalling entirely as soon as it first starts up. And the reason that it would stall is because with our create save loop function, we are using a while loop inside of here. So that's why we need to use task.spawn whenever we call this function. So inside of here, instead of saying create save loop, we're going to say task.spawn, create an anonymous function inside of that task.spawn, and then go ahead and call create save loop and pass through the player. Now, the reason that we have to do that inside of here, but we don't have to do that whenever a player is added to our game, is because you can think of when we listen to an event to be fired off, that anonymous function can thought of as automatically being wrapped in task.spawn. So that's why we can simply just call create save loop inside of here without having to use task.spawn to prevent our script from stalling. But we can't do that right here, and we instead have to use task.spawn deliberately before we actually call create save loop. Anyways, with all that being said, let's go ahead and test this out and hop into our game. So now, once we load into our game, we can actually see our leaderboards right here. And it seems like we actually forgot to make the template not visible, so we're going to need to go ahead and do that. But we can also see that I'm actually displayed inside of the clicks leaderboard right here. And the reason for that is because I actually did just load the game before this test, and I earned 2.1 million clicks, and it did save that and update it right here. But now we can see that this is going to be refreshed in about 5 seconds. Let's go ahead and rebirth. And now when this refreshes, it might display my one rebirth on the rebirth leaderboard, or it might not. And we can actually see that it didn't. The reason that it didn't display my rebirth on the rebirth leaderboards is because we still have to wait for the data to save. And then once it's saved, we then have to wait for the leaderboard to refresh for that updated data to be displayed on the leaderboards. So in a way, the data could be out of sync by a couple of seconds, but realistically, that's not that big of a deal. Anyways, we have about 10 seconds before the leaderboards refresh, so we'll wait until they refresh and see if we now appear on the rebirth leaderboard. We can see that they have refreshed, and I'm now actually number 1 on the gems and the rebirth leaderboards. We can see that I have 1 rebirth, I've accumulated 30 gems, and I can also see myself on the clicks leaderboard as well. So that means that that is all working perfectly. Of course, one of the last things that we need to do is actually hide that template. So we'll go inside of the server storage. Inside of the GUI, inside of the frame, inside of the container, and for this template, we're going to want to go ahead and make that not visible. And now that we've done that, we're all good to go with the GUI. You might want to go back to your leaderboards module script, and you may want to go back to your constant variables and change the get state as well as the save earnings times. Now, realistically, using these cooldowns, say a 20-second cooldown for saving the player's data and a 60-second cooldown for getting all the leaderboard information, those timings should be perfectly fine to not actually go over the data store quota limit. But if you want to be a little bit on the safer side, you could definitely increase those numbers. For example, we could decide to only update the leaderboards every 3 minutes, and then when it comes to saving the player's data, we could do that every, say, 5 minutes. Like I said though, feel free to adjust this to your liking, whatever works for you. As long as you're not getting any errors in your output from the data store service, then you should be perfectly fine. Also, one last thing to mention is that how do you actually reset your leaderboards? Well, you would just change the string that we're passing through to the get ordered data store function. It's really similar to how you reset your normal player data. So what you actually have to do is change the key of the get ordered data store, and that'll change your data. So we could change all of these to 2, and that would effectively reset the leaderboard, starting off with nobody being on the leaderboard at all. Anyways, ladies and gentlemen, with that all being said, that's going to be it for this episode. As always, if you guys did enjoy the video, smash the like button. Feel free to go down below in the description to check out my Patreon if you guys want to support me and gain access to all the scripts and the game file that we made during this episode. And with that being said, I'll see you guys in the next video.